Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for May 29th, 2018. On today's episode, we'll discuss Solo, A Star Wars Story's disappointing box office and have a full spoiler discussion about that film. This is Slash Film Editor-in-Chief Peter Sciretta, and joining me on today's podcast is Slash Film Weekend Editor Brad Oman.
Hey, that's me.
And joining us is our Star Wars expert. He writes for Slash Film, but he also writes for a number of other sites, spreading his wisdom about a galaxy far, far away, and that is Bryan Young.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're here, of course, to talk about Solo, A Star Wars Story. Slash Filmcast did a review of the film, which I strongly disagree with. But I've already shared my opinion on this film. I don't think either of you has. So let's start, Bryan, let's start with you. What are your brief thoughts on, Solo?
This movie was more fun than I was expecting. The last thing I expected to feel when I left this film was wanting more films like this with Han Solo. And so I was very pleasantly surprised. I feel like reasonable expectations, but, as a caper and a heist film, it was a lot of fun. As a Star Wars film, it gave me a lot of those touchstones to the things I wanted. And as a deep canon nerd for Star Wars, it offered me so much more to include in that rich tapestry. So I don't know, maybe I'm just the sort of person they make Star Wars films for, but it worked very well for me.
I've seen the film 3 times now, and I don't know. I don't understand anybody who cannot enjoy this film. It's not the best Star Wars film. I don't think it, holds a candle to, the recent saga films, but, I don't know. I liked it more than Rogue One. Brad, you recently wrote a spoiler review for the site, but I don't think you've spoken about your feelings about the film on the podcast. So, what did you think of Solo?
Yeah, I've seen it twice now, and I found myself enjoying it tremendously both times, purely as entertainment. But as a Star Wars fan, I feel like it does a disservice to characters, both old and new. And the constant winks and nods to things happening in the future feel like it lessens the impact of the movie and, I don't know, makes certain things less significant and a little bit more hokey. And honestly, for a movie that's called Solo, A Star Wars Story, it doesn't really give you much of a reason to care about Han Solo as a character and doesn't really give us much to dig into as far as understanding, more about who he is that we didn't already know just based on his personality traits and how he behaves in the original trilogy. So, it's this, if anything, this feels like it's a movie that's specifically made to recruit new Star Wars fans, that this could be like a gateway for them to discover the original trilogy and view Star Wars, I guess, in a different context than we're used to.
Okay, so before we get into our Solo discussion, our spoiler discussion, let's talk about the box office, because I think this is important to talk about. Solo, A Star Wars Story, was, there was all this news coming out that, the pre-sales for the first day outdid, the Marvel movies, and the projections were very high. They were projecting it to be the biggest Memorial Day weekend opener of all time, being around 150 million, and throughout the weekend, that number just kept on dwindling down until it got down to near 100 million. Brad, what do we know?
Yeah, we know it definitely didn't perform near the early expectations, which were thinking that it would set a new Memorial Day weekend record. And it wasn't exactly what you would call a bomb, but it was pretty disappointing by Star Wars standards and expectations, because for the 3-day weekend, it only took in 83.3 million, which is just a little more than half of what Rogue One did in its 3-day opening weekend. That movie pulled in 155 million. And then for the 4-day holiday weekend, which usually allows it to get a little bit more, it didn't really do anything spectacular business-wise, because it only pulled in 103 million domestically. So it's not doing so hot, and it would have been a little bit better if Rogue One kind of set the bar lower by being like, okay, these Star Wars spinoffs aren't going to be quite as big of blockbusters as the, milestone Star Wars episodes. But Rogue One did significantly better, so it's, really Lucasfilm kind of has to take a look at this and see what went wrong, why this movie isn't performing nearly as well as Rogue One did, and figure out what the issue is.
Yeah, that's what I want to talk about here. And first of all, we should be clear that this is a disappointment, but not a disaster. This film with these kind of numbers will break even probably, just with the box office and, licensing out the movie to cable and premium networks alone, right? That doesn't include merchandising. So Disney is going to make money off this movie. It's just, not on the level that they thought. I think they thought every Star Wars movie was going to be $1 billion hit. And this is the first time that they think that it isn't. So I wanted to ask you guys, what do you think? Why do you think this is? Do you think Rogue One was just riding off that high of The Force Awakens and not having a Star Wars film in a decade, or do you think we're seeing actual Star Wars fatigue? Like we do get these Marvel movies, multiple times a year, and we're not seeing fatigue yet, at least from the box office numbers. I know I do hear, critics complain from time to time. The tracking kept dropping over the weekend. Does that mean there was bad word of mouth? The film got an A+ or A- cinema score, which is pretty high. What do you guys think?
I wonder. Oh, go ahead.
No, you got it.
I wonder if some of it is Memorial Day weekend has been increasingly difficult, especially for Disney. You go back over the last years, and they haven't been able to really break a hit. I mean, they got Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End is the best opening that they've done, and that was only $139 million on a Memorial Day. Solo is still the 7th best Memorial Day, but I've talked to a lot of people who are Star Wars fans who just feel like too many movies that they've wanted to see have come out. And this weekend they went to go see Deadpool, slating Solo for next weekend. There is no malicious intent against Solo for them in saying, I'm going to wait a week. It's just there's a lot of really nerd-centric movies out right now. And I wonder if Christmas is just the right place. I'm one of those who feels like Star Wars is a summer movie. I've been saying from the beginning it should be in May. But maybe this proves that I'm wrong, and it should be in December. And maybe that's where Rogue One had those legs, is just those holiday weekends and family at home in the winter, to drag everybody to the movie repeatedly is what did it, rather than Memorial Day, where it seems like nowadays it's not the event movie weekend it used to be.
Brad, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like it's definitely a perfect storm that, is the release date, I think, in the middle of a crowded blockbuster summer when two of the summer's biggest movies, have been in theaters for a month and 2 weeks, actually just 1 week for Deadpool 2, respectively. And, it's a lot harder to get people to go out to the movies multiple weeks in a row over the summer, especially when the weather's so nice and people have time off work and they'd rather spend it doing other things. Because even Solo, didn't do so well this weekend. It still was the best Memorial Day weekend in 4 years. So it still did, decent business in theaters. But I think one of the other problems is, and this speaks more to just the movie itself, is that I talked to a lot of people who are not necessarily hardcore Star Wars fans. They're more general audience folk who didn't really feel like a need to rush out and see Solo right away, the same way they did with with something like The Last Jedi. And I think when you have a movie like that coming out just 5 months after The Last Jedi, people are just not necessarily in the mood to rush out to see another Star Wars. I think, you need some extra time to build that desire back up. And that may not be a problem with Marvel, but I think the difference is Marvel has such a wide variety of different superheroes that allow for different genres and tones to play out, that when it comes to Star Wars, we haven't really seen a wide variety of what can be done as far as different genres in the Star Wars universe is yet. So, this looks like just another Star Wars movie for most people. And then on another end of the spectrum, there's plenty of people who didn't like the Star Wars prequels. And this was, basically another Star Wars prequel. And so maybe fans didn't necessarily feel compelled to rush out and see it because it wasn't offering anything that they felt confident in.
Yeah, I'm wondering, what does Disney and Lucasfilm need to do? You see a lot of, people on Twitter, Star Wars fans who are not the most logical people, but demanding that Kathleen Kennedy should be fired. Look at all the problems that these films have been stricken with, and this number is kind of very disappointing. Although it should be mentioned that this number is higher than any of the opening weekends of the Star Wars movies that Fox released, other than Revenge of the Sith. So I mean, I know it's been a different time and it's different, cost of a movie ticket.
It was really funny too to see Ron Howard react to it. People were like, "Hey, box office is disappointing," and his reply on Twitter was like, "This is my personal best record for box office." So,
yeah,
it might be disappointing, but this is the best I've ever done. And if you look at the type of movie it is, capers and heist movies, it has the best opening weekend of any caper or heist movie ever. So maybe Star Wars isn't the metric to look at more as like, hey, how have Ron Howard and caper and heist movies done? And it's at the top of all those.
Yeah. What Ron Howard has been doing on Twitter is remarkable, along with John Kasdan, the screenwriter. They've been responding to fans, both positive and negative, in a classy way. And it's great to see that, and not, the usual way that sometimes Hollywood reacts, where you have The Rock, going on Twitter and being like, I made this for the fans, not the critics, or whatever, I want, the last thing I want to get to is what should Disney do going forward? I would suggest that they need to, start making these Star Wars movies as if they aren't all these huge, big, epic movies. They need to adopt the Marvel way of doing things in that, Marvel makes an Ant-Man, and they also make an Avengers Infinity War. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't all have to be of the same box office, budget level, and of that, they can make smaller Star Wars films. They can make bigger Star Wars films. What do you guys think?
I think that's what Kathy Kennedy's been doing. I think Rogue One made more money than they expected it to.
Yeah.
But if you look at how much Disney paid out for Star Wars, and you see how much money they've put in to the franchise as a whole, I don't think they're looking at this balance sheet on an individual basis of movies. They're looking at it, how much are we investing in making the movies and how much are they bringing in? Over the 4 movies, they've made their money back plus some repeatedly. So if one of them is smaller, even though it costs more, I think that Kathleen Kennedy was willing to double the budget to put out the movies she wanted to. Means she's more interested in the long game and making sure the movies are right, rather than how much money she's going to make specifically on this movie or that movie.
Brad, do you have any advice on or thoughts on where Disney should be going with this franchise in the wake of this disappointment?
It's one thing to look at this from a business perspective and be worried that these movies aren't making as much money as they should. But it might sound a little bit hokey, but I think the more important thing is that they just keep telling the stories that they think need to be told and give fans, something to be excited about. Obviously Disney
but that might be it though. Do fans want are the stories that need to be told need to be prequels of all these characters? I feel when Disney bought Marvel, Marvel is great because it's all about characters. Do you know what I mean? People want to see Iron Man, people want to see Ant-Man, people want to see these characters. But I felt like when Disney bought Star Wars, they were buying a universe, not characters. I want to see stories in this universe. I don't care to see, a Han Solo movie as much as I enjoyed it. I don't want to see an Obi-Wan movie. I don't want to see a Boba Fett movie. I want to see, new stories in this galaxy and not these prequel films.
No, and I mostly agree with you. I want to see stuff that doesn't include characters that we're familiar with and goes to new locations and doesn't feel this inherent need to tie to something, in movies that were already established in the original trilogy or even the prequels. And I think that Star Wars faces a challenge that isn't normally faced by a big studio franchise, because this is the longest running franchise that now has new installments tied to the old installments, where you have generations of fans who are looking at this as one single entity. Like, obviously, something like Star Trek has spanned this long, but the new movies aren't really connected to the old movies or even the old series, and in the same way that these new Star Wars movies are. So Disney and Lucasfilm faced the unique challenge of pleasing fans who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and whatnot, but also pulling in new fans who may not be quite as familiar with the original trilogy, or who grew up seeing the prequels first, and maybe even new fans who aren't, even aware that like Star Wars is something they like yet. And I don't think any other blockbuster franchise has to worry about that. Even Marvel, they've only come around in the past 10 years, and so all of their fans are pretty much aren't too different in age as they were from when they first started watching those movies. So it's a challenge. I think they're gonna have to figure out how to embrace it. And Solo does an interesting job of attempting to do that by having a movie that is full of winks and nods to the original trilogy, hinting at things to come that we know happened between Han and Lando and Chewie, but also introducing Han as a character to audiences that may not be as familiar with him and maybe only know him from the newer Star Wars movies. So I honestly don't know. It's a tough act to balance, and I hope that they are able to figure it out. And I really hope that the new trilogies that Rian Johnson and the Game of Thrones duo are working on offer us something new that we can latch onto that becomes the Star Wars for a new generation.
Can we at least all agree that they need to get rid of the stupid "A Star Wars Story" tagline from the titles?
My only complaint about that is writing articles about it and having to type it a lot.
But
in theory, it doesn't bother me one way or the other too much.
But do you think, like, general public, like, that makes them want to see the film? Like, that makes it almost seem...
it's SEO optimization, right? Like, they have to get Star Wars in the title.
I guess. But aren't people going to know it's going to be Star Wars? Like, when you have a movie called Han Solo, you could have just called it Han Solo. And it's weird, too, because when you go see this movie or you see a poster or marketing, it tells you to write about this on social media with hashtag Han Solo, not Solo, because Solo is a cup. So it's like, I don't know. It seems like their brand messaging on these films are like all over the place. And also another nitpick of mine from a fan point of view is like, Rogue One didn't have an opening crawl. This doesn't have an opening crawl, but it has like words on the screen in blue font. Why don't we just do the opening crawl? Like, they do the opening crawl in every comic book. It's been done in the video games. Like, why are we going against that consistency of this franchise? I just don't understand.
I think that has to do with confusing audiences. At this point, where all we have are the saga films and these two, keeping the crawl off of them at this point is just a way to differentiate. But I agree. I wouldn't mind a crawl, but the opening to Solo was really cool. The snaps and sparks of him hot wiring it and then flying through the logo, and that bit of John Powell music remixing John Williams' Han Solo theme. I don't know. I've seen the movie 6 times now, and it's really working on me.
6 times, wow. You've doubled my amount of times. Okay, well, let's get into it with our spoiler discussion. So if you have not seen Solo: A Star Wars Story, tune out now. Save this for after you have seen the film, because we're gonna be diving in to all the spoilery details and giving you some context on those from our Star Wars expert. Let's talk about Han's arc in this film. I know I've read a lot of critics kind of slamming it as the same arc that he has in the original trilogy, but I don't know. I think it's different. I think this film, he starts off as an optimistic. He's saying, "I have a good feeling about this," and he is kind of this good guy trying to pretend to be a bad guy. And I think when we meet him in the new trilogy, he has successfully done that. Successfully become the bad guy, but he has at the core of him, as we find out, goodness in him. Am I wrong?
That's very much the impression I got, where it felt like it was this inverse of his arc through the classic trilogy, where in those, in those films, you've got him trying to convince Leia, no, I'm a nice man, but here he's trying to convince the woman he loves that he's a terrible person. It also ties a lot to his arc with Rey, right? They came from such much more similar circumstances than I would have guessed. And they both had to scrabble on the street to do those things. But it also, I felt like it tied to Anakin's story, right? Where which makes Ben Solo a lot more interesting, where his two, sort of paternal influences in his lineage both had really horrible upbringings with very terrible options for them, and the choices that Anakin and Han Solo both made diverged wildly. And now Ben is riding that line. I think it added a lot of interesting context for me there. I didn't feel like it was the same thing.
I do think that at the end of this film, when Han shoots first and kills Beckett, that isn't something he would have done at the beginning of this film. I feel like, there is an arc. Brad, any thoughts?
I mean, I don't know about that. I mean, he's been an Imperial soldier, and sure he's reluctant simply because the cause of their fight isn't anything that he's interested in fighting, because like he says, like the Empire is the one considered the hostiles because they're just infiltrating planets. But I mean, he's pretty aggressive, and he's willing to do what it takes to survive. And in this case, I don't know. I think the specific leap, is basically becoming Beckett and not trusting anybody. But at the same time, it doesn't really feel like it's anything, I don't know, significant to me. Like I'm not sure that he does a lot to try to convince anybody that he's a bad guy. I just think that he doesn't view himself in all that favorable of a light because he's grown up living a life of crime and has had to scrape by, doing some pretty shady, things. So I don't know. I feel like his arc in this is only interesting based on the hypothetical things that we'll continue to learn about him. For me, the most interesting things about Han in this movie are stuff that barely gets explored. Like there's that quick mention of his father building ships like the Millennium Falcon, and there's we don't necessarily know why he holds onto those dice. And as stupid as the scene is, where he's given the name Solo just by an Imperial officer, the idea that I feel like there's an inkling that he does know what his last name is, but he just doesn't want to say it for whatever reason, is more interesting to me than anything else that is part of his origin in this movie. So for me, I think that the better arc is going to come from what will be revealed in the sequels that may or may not come, considering Solo was so disappointing at the box office, rather than him becoming the Han Solo that we already know he's going to become.
But I think that there's a really interesting case to be made for the fact that we don't necessarily need that large of an arc out of him, that even if a lot of the fun set pieces in this film reinforce what we know about Han, like I always assumed that the Falcon was really fast and that's how they got through the Kessel Run, not Han's brazen stupidity. And that just reinforces my love for the character, and I think that that's okay when you have franchises this big that have other material to rely on too.
For sure, but at the same time, I think that that's also just treading water of him doing the stuff we already know Han does. Like, there's not much of an origin there. It's just like, this just he's just always been this guy, So while I had fun with the movie, I just feel like it doesn't do much to further the character of Han Solo for me, and that's coming from somebody who loves Han Solo, as one of his favorite characters in the original trilogy. So yeah, I don't know, especially because since he dies in Force Awakens, like, you would think that the origin story might add a little bit more meat to him as a character and make you feel something because he is gone now. And all it does is make me frustrated that the Solo name, which is, has been passed on to Ben Solo, is made up.
See, I felt like the film did add a lot to that ending scene with Ben and Han, by comparing and contrasting that with the situation with Han and Beckett, where Beckett doesn't want to give, like, Beckett is sort of adopted by Han as this father figure and doesn't want to give him the opportunity to lead a better life than he did. And Han, having lived through this and going in and giving his son that opportunity in Force Awakens, it makes that scene, it gives that scene a lot further of a sweep for me from here to there, and kind of really shows the core of what Han is as a character, and makes that decision more interesting for me.
Yeah. I also want to point out, you're talking a bit about his time in the Imperial Army, and I think that's kind of interesting. I think it's, a lot of critics are, writing this off as just, a fun film that has nothing to it. But, like, that moment where he's arguing with his Imperial, lieutenant or captain.
Lieutenant, yeah.
Like, I think is very interesting politically to put in a blockbuster film for, general America, because it kind of shows how you could be part of, like, the bad guys aren't like, oh, let's go around and do bad stuff. They believe that they are, killing the hostiles. They are, saving the planet. They are, they are being told by their leaders that they're accomplishing good, even though they were obviously part of this galactic empire. And Brad, I know in the Slack channel you were talking a bit about Corellia and how that was kind of smart. I was wondering if you could talk about that here.
Wait, which part? I'm confused.
Them trying to get off the occupation of on.
Oh yeah. That's one thing that I appreciate, that I wish that they was a little bit more to it, because it's such a quick scene that kind of goes by. Is that there's a lot of parallels to be drawn with the scene of all the border patrol of letting people in and out of Corellia, and tied to the idea that we have today's political climate of dreamers being denied asylum here, or being allowed to stay here for jobs for their families, because the Empire is regulating everything about the planet, and you see a brief thing of families being torn apart, and all these people being forced to live a life of crime because they're being denied any other opportunity to achieve something in a more legitimate way. That's the whole introduction to Han, with Lady Proxima and the groups of orphans just stealing stuff and selling it to try and get by. It definitely has this Slumdog Millionaire vibe to it, that is surprisingly relevant for a movie that is supposed to be about Han Solo. There are interesting ways where Star Wars almost accidentally becomes topical, because when this movie was written, the Dreamers thing wasn't really a big deal yet, and so it's kind of just shows how you can find these interesting themes with the real world compared to Star Wars movies all the time.
It felt very Casablanca, that point to me.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the film. This film production has been obviously well written about. Lord and Miller were the original directors. They were late into the production and removed and replaced with Ron Howard, who came in and reportedly shot 70% of the footage that we see in this final film. I think it's worth mentioning because I didn't feel like certain scenes were Lord and Miller or certain scenes were Ron Howard. I couldn't tell the difference. I wanted to hear what you guys thought.
I felt very much the DNA of the film that I felt the most was Lawrence Kasdan, with John Kasdan's references throughout, more than Ron Howard or Lord and Miller, to be honest, for me.
Brad?
I think a lot of the comedy involving L3 is a Lord and Miller thing.
See, I would have thought that, but then, there's the comedy of that starts at when they go to meet Lando, right? And L3 is outside that bot battle.
Yeah.
And Clint Howard is the person that is orchestrating that bot battle. And, that's obviously a scene that Ron Howard shot, and not Lord and Miller. I don't know. I'm not saying that all the comedy that L3 had was Ron Howard, because it obviously isn't. But
yeah, certainly not all of it. But the one that stands out to me, and I talked to somebody else about this Mike Ryan and I had a conversation about it, where when L3 is unlocking or sawing through the gate to get to the Millennium Falcon, and she's like trying to get them not to look at her as if she were like somebody who is like peeing and has stage fright about it by peeing in public. It's such a weird thing that doesn't feel like Star Wars at all. It feels like a Lord and Miller bit.
What? Now that you mention that, I didn't notice that while in my 3 rewatches of the film. But yeah, that totally could be a Lord and Miller thing.
Yeah, and I think even the implied sexual relationship stuff with Lando and L3 feels like more of a Lord and Miller thing. Like I'm sure that the subtext of the romance between them was there, but I think being a little bit more obvious about it, the conversation between Kira and L3 might have been something that Lord and Miller concocted.
Yeah, well, and to be honest, it seems like for them to have got this film finished in 10 months, a lot of the action set pieces would have had to have already been through pre-visualization, and ILM had to have already been working on that stuff for Ron Howard to step in and finish this quickly on a film of this scale. So I definitely think there's stuff there, but I think Ron Howard was able to massage it into a piece where you couldn't see the seams as much as you could with, say, Joss Whedon in Justice League.
Yeah, for sure. I talked to Ron Howard at the junket. I'll put a link in the show notes, but he talks a little bit about that this unusual process of coming in late in production and what that means. And really, to break it down, we played it on the podcast last week, but it seemed like it was more of like he's coming into a production that was already set with cast, crew, designs, and he's playing with those toys. That that was kind of how he put it. Let's break into details of the actual film. Hans Dice. Brad, I know you have some stuff to say about this. Do you think this has makes them mean any less or more?
It's somewhere in the middle because and I was frustrated by this because I saw several outlets writing headlines that said Solo: A Star Wars Story explains the significance of Hans Dice, and it's like, no, it doesn't. It makes them slightly more significant because he hands them off to Kira and he gets them back, and we see that he carries them around everywhere with him, but there's no explanation whatsoever as to why he carries them around. The old Legends explanation used to be that they were the dice that helped him win the Millennium Falcon, but we know that that's not the case based on what happens in this movie, and he has these dice from the very first scene that we see him, because the speeder that he steals after he jacks that vial of coaxium in the beginning of the movie, he takes the dice and puts them on, the rear view mirror, what would be the rear view mirror area of the speeder. So he has them, and he considers them a memento of some sort, but we have no idea why or where they came from. So it gives them a little more significance, but not in any way where we understand what they mean to him. It's just something that he carries around.
It feels like that Lawrence Kasdan style of filmmaking of storytelling where he'll drop a line or drop significance to an object or something that we're supposed to imply has meaning to the character, but not necessarily to us. For me, going through the rest of the Star Wars saga, you notice the only other time we see dice are in Phantom Menace with Watto and Qui-Gon in the wager over Anakin and Shmi, and you see that the Force easily subverts the luck that dice are supposed to represent to someone like Han. And so when you kind of contrast that and connect some dots, granted, you have to do some dot connecting to arrive, but when Han is saying, I don't believe in luck, and these dice are sort of around in this representation of him, and then you see that the Force can so easily subvert luck. And even Han is subverting his own luck and sort of making his own destiny at the end of this film with how he wins the Falcon, that it makes you wonder if Han really is just a Jedi of luck rather than the Force, and if are those two things even different?
That's an interesting reading that I did not think about.
I do like that contrast between Han, relying on luck, and Luke, relying on the Force to guide him once he meets Obi-Wan and whatnot. That's something interesting. But I feel like for him to carry those around, like there's got to be some kind of significance to him. Like maybe he got them from his father, or something like that.
More stories to tell.
Yeah, I don't want to touch too far onto this because I know you guys talked about it on the podcast on Friday. But L3's legacy and the weirdness that this kind of story puts her in, I know when I was at the junket, Brian, I think it was you that kind of explained to me how the death and the I guess rebirth of L3 in the Millennium Falcon actually has an echo in the original trilogy.
So it has a number of them, actually. I went back and rewatched the trilogy post-Solo, and you can see that screen, that panel readout that where she maps the Maw and the Kessel. That's front and center in all the shots of the cockpit from A New Hope forward. So there's that, but you've also got 3PO sort of arguing with the Falcon and Empire, and his line, I think, very directly references her, where he says, I don't know where your ship learned to communicate, but it has the most peculiar dialect. And Jason Fry doubled down on it further in the Last Jedi novelization, where he's got this snippet of a scene told from R2's perspective, where R2's like, there's 3 different droid brains inside the Falcon, and one of them likes dirty jokes and this kind of thing, and that's the only way you can coax that particular part of the Falcon to do what you want, is to like engage with it as a person.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, that's funny.
At the same time, though, I do find myself a bit troubled by it, simply because it almost makes Han kind of a jerk for taking the Falcon away from Lando. Like, obviously, Lando's willing to risk it because he bets it during the games that he knows he'll win. But for Han to take back the Falcon knowing that L3 is in the ship is kind of like an even bigger,
Well, he also says in that line, like, doesn't he say something like, she likes me more or something?
Yeah, the feeling's mutual.
Yeah, she belongs with me.
Or she belongs with me. Like, I didn't get any indication that L3 liked Han.
No, I don't think that's a reference to L3. I think that's just the reference to referring to the ship as she, captains constantly do with their ships. But the more troubling aspect to me is that there's a whole, long time period where neither Lando nor Han are captain of the Millennium Falcon, and L3 is just stuck in that ship.
I think there's something really exciting about her ending too, though, where she realizes that the call for her life, for her existence, is rebellion, and she's part of the crew that makes that shot against Death Star 2.
Yeah, but at the same time, she's also a droid that was calling for rebellion and wanted droid rights, and now all she is something that is used to help humans out, and she's stuck in this thing where, and
dramatic irony.
Well, and it's true. But and I think the biggest problem I have with it is, if it was so easy for them to quickly transfer her consciousness into the ship, why wouldn't it have been just as easy for them to transfer her consciousness into another droid and save her that way?
There's a lot of interesting stuff in the Poe Dameron comic. Kind of doubles down on the idea that you can just keep copies of droids' personalities, which is how Mr. Bones kind of makes an appearance. Mr. Bones from the Aftermath books, which is a murderous battle droid, makes an appearance in the Poe Dameron comics. So there's a huge gap of time where maybe when Lando hands the Falcon over to Han, maybe they do make a copy of her and put her out there. But then that raises a lot of interesting science fiction ideas where which is the real L3? Is there one a clone? Is there one in the ship? How does that work?
Well, do we even know that L3 is a sentient being and this isn't just a programming?
Well, I mean, she has that we get into that gets into the whole idea of what is real and what do you consider real? The Westworld question, because she clearly had personality and she made choices of her own. She was the one who created the droid revolution on Kessel. That wasn't something that someone told her to do. She just did that of her own volition.
I wonder how much of that was actually in the original script, because I know at the press conference, which, Brian, you were at, I think someone asked if, who created that line in the movie of Equal Rights. and that was the writers. I think John credited it to the actress Phoebe, which makes me almost think that was like an impromptu line, and they decided to make that a bigger plot in the movie that might have not been there.
Which makes me wonder if that was Lord and Miller, because it feels like a lot of what Ron Howard was brought on to do was to stick to the script rather than do a lot of that improvising.
Yeah. But it definitely seems weird in a movie where at the end her consciousness or her data or whatever you want to say is put into the Millennium Falcon to be stored forever, and it's kind of like this Black Mirror-ish thing. It seems weird to end, a character that has been talking the whole movie about equal rights and it just seems very, very weird. But let's move on to Enphy's Nest. This is a cool new group of characters introduced in this film, kind of like space pirates. In the end of the film, they do this big reveal. The girl takes off her helmet. Is she Enphy, or is she the daughter? Do we know?
I think she's the daughter of the original Enphy's Nest, is what I think she implies, but I mean, her name could very well be Enphy's as well.
And that moment is almost played as like this huge reveal, and almost every time I've seen the movie, people have come up to me after and been like, is that someone I should know, like, from the comics or from Rebels, or, is like, it's played as like this big moment, but I think the moment is just that, she is a young kid, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I when I first saw it too, I was confused as well. I thought that there was something I was missing, either from Star Wars Rebels or something like that, where they were referencing, the offspring of a character that we were supposed to know, or something like that. Because when she takes off the mask, it's pretty dramatic, and I guess the reveal is kind of shocking that it's a young girl. But I don't know, maybe it's a good way of showing the progress that we're making, that we're not really surprised when a cool character like that is a girl.
Yeah, I think that is the case. At first I thought it was like, oh, could this be Val's daughter in some way? Because,
that was my first
darker skin too. And, my head is like, why would Hollywood cast two dark-skinned actresses? I don't know. That's bad, to think that way, but I always, underestimate Hollywood, I think, in those ways. But okay, so let's talk about Enphy's crew, because there's a bunch of people we have seen before. Bryan, can you break it down for us?
Yeah, so there's at least two members of her crew that we have seen in prior movies. One of them is one of the Two Tubes sort of brother. They're eggmates from Rogue One, and I'm not sure if it's Edrio or Benthic, and I'm not sure that there's been any clarification of that. The other is Warwick Davis.
That's one of Saw's men? Right? Yeah,
one of Saw's men. So presumably this group will either dissolve into or lead into Saw's group of partisans, and this is sort of the proto version of that. And the other is Warwick Davis's character, Weasel, who we first saw in Phantom Menace in Watto's box during the pod race, and he sort of lost his fortune when Anakin won that race. And in the Legends material, he became an arms dealer, but now it looks like he joined the proto-rebellion. And I think that was probably not necessarily done with a plan in mind. It was more like, well, Warwick Davis has already shown his face in these Star Wars movies, and the timeline here works about right. Let's just make it that same character.
So you're saying we're not going to get a Star Wars story based on that character in the near future?
I hope we do, and I hope it's called Weasel, and I hope Ron Howard directs it, and it's just going to be the spiritual successor to Willow.
Is there anything else to point out here in this Enphy's Nest?
Yeah, so the whole gang is based on the Cloud Riders, which is the very, very first EU story that Marvel Comics told as soon as they were done with the adaptation of A New Hope in 77, 78. And so this was this swoop gang called the Cloud Riders, which is what Enphys's gang is called. And originally it cast Han Solo in a Seven Samurai-like story where these moisture farmers or dirt farmers or whatever hired him and a group of other mercenaries, including Jackson the Green Rabbit and a Jedi named Don Juan Quixote, to defend them against the Cloud Riders. And they
That's
took
a little on the nose for reference.
Yeah, it's spelled really weird too. So I guess maybe in the 70s they thought kids just wouldn't understand the literary allusions to that. But so the Cloud Riders originated from that, and the aesthetic of their swoops and their speeders and whatnot came directly from those early Marvel comics.
Okay, I think a lot of people are probably here because they want to hear what we're going to say about Maul, who is revealed to be the head of Crimson Dawn. Or is he the head of Crimson Dawn? Is that what it's...
Yeah, I think so.
Kira is going to meet him and Dathomir, which is where we see him first in Rebels, right?
We see him first in Rebels actually on the planet Malachor. He's been stuck there, marooned by Sith Inquisitors who sort of lost track of him, and his ship is destroyed, and he's marooned on this Sith temple. But we do go back to sort of his office on Dathomir. There was a genocide on Dathomir in Clone Wars where General Grievous and the Separatists sort of killed everyone there. So Dathomir is sort of an empty planet, and Maul went back there during this time to sort of research what his family lineage was doing with the Force. And we did get a glimpse of his office, or his cave, I guess is more a better term than his office. In Rebels, he takes Ezra there and uses that dark magic, that stone table, to possess Kanan Jarrus. And, so we do have an idea of what Dathomir would look like, but it's not any sort of teeming metropolis where he'd want to run an underworld unless he's just hiding from Palpatine, because the last time Palpatine found out he was alive, he came to kill him personally.
Yeah, and, this might even be very confusing for people who have not watched Clone Wars or Rebels, because, last time we saw Maul on the big screen, he was cut in two and falling down a shaft.
Yeah.
How did he survive?
He was literally too angry to die. The rage and the dark side of the Force kept him alive, and apparently Dathomiri physiology allows this, and he ended up in a trash bin that transported him to a planet called Lotho Minor, which was it was basically the dump of the galaxy. So the entire planet was just sort of the dumping grounds where they'd bring trash. And he lived there in obscurity and in mental distress. He was not well. He was completely shell-shocked, PTSD to the nth degree, until his brother, who was briefly Count Dooku's apprentice and Sith enforcer, was betrayed by Dooku and was sent on a mission to go find his brother. And at that point, Maul came back. His mother, who was a powerful Force user, helped clear his mind and took the spider legs he'd constructed in his madness away and gave him more reasonable, realistic mechanical legs, very much like the ones we saw in Solo. And he tried to open up...
For people who have only seen this film once, it's hard to catch if you're not looking for it. But that first shot, they kind of you see his legs, which are mechanical.
Yeah, that was the first tip-off. Like, when I saw the close-up and they were mechanical legs, and then that first breath of Sam Witwer's, it all clicked into me. I was with my son at that premiere, and I was nudging him excitedly, and he was like, "Dad, why are you touching me?" So at that point, he actually took control of all the syndicates in the underworld in the galaxy to open up a new front in the war, and Palpatine sort of put some of that down, but Maul was able to escape with the help of the Mandalorians and some factions of the underworld that were still loyal to him. But the Pike Syndicate, which is something he did take over, that we see on Kessel here in this movie, left him, and that's why there's that fragile truce between them, because they left because Maul was unstable and they didn't want to be part of what he then called his Shadow Collective.
So what is he doing here? Because we really don't get a sense of what Crimson Dawn is doing. They're collecting that fuel to basically, because it's worth money.
I think the fuel's worth money, but I wonder. I think that idea of what it is he's trying to do, other than underworld crap, is still a little nebulous. Especially since we don't really know what he was doing during this time, other than trying to hide from Inquisitors. Because we get a glimpse of what was the Siege of Mandalore, where the Jedi, right on the eve of Order 66, show up on Mandalore to take control of that planet back from Maul, which we got in the Ahsoka book. And then in the canon, we lost track of him completely until we find him in Rebels. So this is the first glimpse of something between those two moments.
Yeah, and it should be, like, this seems like an obvious setup for sequels, right? Like, this isn't, a lot of people are calling this a cameo, and I think people don't understand what the word cameo means. Like, this is not a cameo. This is a plot point. This is a big reveal that's setting up something more. Question is what? Which is very interesting, because when I talked to Kathleen Kennedy at the Force Awakens junket, which was 2.5 years ago, she told me straight out that the anthology films would not be setting up sequels of any kind. That the standalone films were standalone films that would not have sequels. And now 2.5 years later, that's clearly different. So I'm kind of wondering what changed. I did do an interview with Ron Howard and the Kasdans, and I'll link to that in the show notes. The interesting thing is Howard talks about when he first got the script for this, that in the script it just said boss. It didn't say who it was, and he had assumed that Lucasfilm and Disney had chosen someone for this role, and he was instead presented with a list of characters it could possibly be that he would choose, and on top of that list was Maul. Kasdan say that is, or John Kasdan says that was who he wanted all along, and he kind of like put hints towards it all throughout the movie. But I kind of wonder if in the Lord and Miller version, if it was a more simple kind of like reveal, like just more of a cameo, like, it was Jabba the Hutt or something. Do you have any thoughts, either of you?
I talked to John Kasdan at the after party, and he said as far as the sequel idea, that his hope was that they wrote it open-ended enough, but there hadn't been plans, but hopefully the movie does well enough to get one. So I think it was their plan to write something that could open up to that world. And I think I believe I was told that Lord and Miller were proponents of Maul as well. And you can see that through all the drafts of the screenplay, as far as what we ended up getting on screen, with the references to Terrace Kasi and the references to the Pike Syndicate and how that worked, and how Voss has a Sith holocron in his office. There's a lot of clues to that, and Crimson Dawn sounds like the sort of name a red-bladed lightsaber user would come up with for a criminal organization. Yeah. You know what I mean? But if you go through the canon timeline, it wouldn't really make sense to be anybody else. I know some people had kind of held out hope that it was Snoke somehow, but I think that would have made far less sense.
I mean, it could have been one of the Hutts, no, right? Like, it's a criminal organization operating away from the Empire, because you can't have the Empire. They're stealing from the Empire at one point, right? I don't know. I'm curious. Another thing that Ron Howard told me, which you can read in our piece on slashfilm.com, I'll link in the show notes, is that they reshot the Maul stuff. That initially it was more low key, that not enough people kind of caught on to who it was. Which I to him said, "Oh, the lightsaber," and he was like, "Yeah, the lightsaber." So I think initially he didn't light up that lightsaber. He probably didn't take off the hood, but they added that in so that more audiences would get it. Brad, we haven't heard from you in a while. What do you think this means for possible sequels?
You mean specifically with the Darth Maul reveal?
Yes, and Kira, obviously.
Yeah,
Kira joining Maul.
It's hard to tell. I feel like it would be interesting, because with Kira, it's obvious that she's not betraying Han Solo because she herself is bad. This is clearly just a way for her to survive. She's stuck in it, and she knows that if she were to make a break, that this is Darth Maul that she's dealing with, and she's not going to be able to escape easily and just fly off into the sunset with Han on the Millennium Falcon. So she's clearly doing what she needs to survive, and doesn't seem to have any bad intentions. So I wonder if her story will be just as important as this continues, as far as maybe taking down Crimson Dawn, since from what I understand, that's not necessarily something that continues too far into the timeline of the original trilogy. Is that correct?
It's not one of the crime syndicates that we've got a lot of information about, and yeah, I don't believe there's any traces of or mention of them.
Yeah.
As we get into the original trilogy, I think.
But that doesn't mean that they aren't around, right?
No, that's true. But I felt like as we ended this film, there were battle lines being drawn where Jabba and Maul already were at odds during the Shadow Collective situation, and it could be very interesting to see a story where Maul and Jabba are going head to head, and their two top favorite lieutenants that they're dealing with are Kira and Han, and they're at odds.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, because it would be cool if whatever job Hutt wants him to do is something that Maul and Crimson Dawn also have their eyes on. And so Kira has to do what she has to survive, and maybe that means actually going against Han, which could create an interesting dynamic for them. I think
and by the way, when I was waiting for my interview with the Kasdans, I was outside. I'm not sure which outlet was interviewing them at the time, but they asked him if the Tatooine mention was for Jabba the Hutt, and John Kasdan said no, not Jabba the Hutt, another Hutt. So,
maybe Zorba the Hutt,
or his son Rhoda the Hutt has completely vanished from the canon since his appearance in the Clone Wars animated film.
Yeah,
interesting. So I do wonder too with Darth Maul is, since this obviously takes place before the storyline that we see with him in Star Wars Rebels and Obi-Wan. Since there is talk of an Obi-Wan movie, do you think that they might try and recreate or give us what happened in Rebels, rather than, because obviously they're not going to retcon it.
Yeah,
they're not going to erase it, but could they remake it in live action form?
Well, this is the most interesting thing about this reveal is I almost feel like they made this reveal either not knowing that Rebels was doing that death, because you don't introduce someone like Maul into this storyline, this continuing storyline, if he already has like an end to him in a dramatic way in the animated series. I almost feel like that animated series was probably already in the works when.
Well, I think the story group would be there to say like, hey, you might not want to do this because of this, but we do see him get. In the cartoon series, they make it pretty definitive that Maul spent all that time looking for Kenobi and didn't find him until he was able to manipulate Ezra into bringing them together. So I'm not sure that unless they do recreate it, there's another opportunity for them to meet. Unless the movie's structurally different and there's some sort of flashbacks to the Clone Wars.
Yeah. I mean, the most interesting thing about it is Han in A New Hope has clearly not seen the Force, right? He is not a believer in the Force. So I don't think he would, as a character, having encountered a Force user in, a former Sith like Maul.
Which is why I think Kira would be the person interfacing with him, or Jabba, who does know what this. I mean, Jabba's dealt with Jedi a lot, and I love one of the original lines that Jabba had in the screenplay, and it's still in the novelization, is when Luke introduces himself as a Jedi Knight, Jabba fires back, "I was killing your kind back when that meant something."
I don't know. Like, I'm kind of wondering. Well, first of all, the box office for this film is not. I mean, it's not good. I'm not sure it's good enough to spawn a sequel. But I'm wondering if they were ever going to do a sequel. Like, I wonder if, the plan originally was to do a Lando movie as a sequel and have Han in the background of that and have this continuing storyline of, Maul and Kira and kind of do the Marvel thing where you're connecting, the overall storyline. I mean, I guess Star Wars was doing it before Marvel, but, Bryan, do you have any sense of what you think they're doing?
Well, we do know that Boba Fett, there's a lot of talk about that, though nothing's specifically confirmed. But we know Boba Fett's been working with Jabba on Tatooine for years, based on the comic books, and the special edition in A New Hope kind of places him with Jabba before the events of Empire, and he's there just hanging out after he's caught Han through all of Jedi. That if we do get a Boba Fett movie, that it could be set post Solo, and that Solo could be a side character, and they're both working for Jabba the Hutt.
Brad, any thoughts on this?
Which part?
Where the story could continue. Do you think now that Solo did not do too well at the box office, do you think they will just relegate this storyline of the lingering threads of Maul and Kira to comic books and video games and novels, or do you think we'll get a continuation in some other standalone movie?
Well, I think the best approach might be to, with that talk of a Lando movie, is to maybe continue this thread as far as the story arc is concerned through other characters. So if you have a Lando movie, then Han would have the role that Lando does in Solo: A Star Wars Story, where he just pops up for a little bit and then disappears. And then, maybe whatever the next one is, maybe it focuses on, maybe it's the Boba Fett movie, and that's another movie where you have Han and Lando maybe pop up, but the movie is mostly about Boba Fett. So if anything, you wouldn't have to continue this as just a Solo franchise, but more so the idea of this being almost like the
Underworld trilogy.
The Underworld trilogy, or this little prequel universe of events that take place before A New Hope.
To finish this off, let's talk a little bit about Easter eggs and fun references in this film. I think probably the one that I caught and was super excited about was in Paul Bettany's character's office. You could see the fertility idol from Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is cool because obviously it's a Lucasfilm thing. And, Star Wars has been referenced in Indiana Jones on the hieroglyphics in the background. I don't know. It was really cool for me to see. Above that is something that looks like a crystal skull, which is not a crystal skull, but actually a reference to an EU novel.
Han Solo and the Lost Legacy, which was one of the original Brian Daley Han Solo books that came out in 79, 80 or so. There's a lot of Indiana Jones references in it, though. There's not just the idol, but there's also one of Dryden's enforcers is named Tot, which is the German enforcer who has his last name's actually Ra, and Tot is the character who had the staff of Ra burned into his hand.
That's fun.
And Kira name checks him, and I feel like the Kessel escape is if you remember, Kasdan was tasked to write Raiders of the Lost Ark, and the minecart chase was originally supposed to be part of that movie, and it got separated out into Temple of Doom. And there's so much of that feeling in the Kessel escape that I wonder if Kasdan was channeling some of those original notes from what his version of what the minecart chase or the slave escape was going to be are in there. But there's the amount of references are ridiculous. Like Glion Salm, the planet that Val and Beckett want to retire to, is the planet that Kit Fisto, the green-skinned Jedi that smiles all the time and was killed by Palpatine in his office in Revenge of the Sith. That's the planet he's from, which is as close to the tropical paradise planet as you can get in Star Wars. Or there's a Galaxy's Edge reference. L3 mentions Black Spire, which was just
which Lando
announced.
couldn't have gotten to without her help.
Yeah, he couldn't even get to Disneyland without her help. But yeah, the village that Galaxy's Edge is recreating is Black Spire Outpost, and it's chock full of references and Easter eggs. Like, we could spend 2 hours talking about all of them.
Yeah, you mentioned before the Terakazi. That's something I think a lot of people catch because a lot of people, played that game on PlayStation. But for those who haven't, can you explain this reference?
Well, hold on.
So,
wait, actually,
go ahead.
hold on. Yeah, because that's the one that I wanted to talk about.
Okay, go for it, Brad.
Yeah,
please.
I'm actually going to work on a little, just like a mini story about it on Slashroom eventually. But I played the PlayStation 1 game, Star Wars Masters of Terrascasi, nonstop. It was a Star Wars fighting game that was basically the Star Wars version of Mortal Kombat, where you could play as Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, Chewbacca, Darth Vader. They even had characters like Mara Jade as unlockable hidden characters. And it was just one of those simple fighting games where you were just on a platform and you fought each other. And each of the characters had certain special moves, like if you charged up your energy enough after landing certain punches and kicks, then you could throw your lightsaber if you were Luke or Mara Jade, or if you were Han and your energy was high enough, you would rapid fire off a bunch of blaster shots that would shoot your opponent into the air and end with like a huge blaster shot and knock them out of the arena. And it was such a fun game. The graphics are not good, and it is not a great game by any means, but I played it endlessly as a kid just because I love Star Wars so much, and it was so much fun. And so to hear Kira mention Terrascasi as this fighting style that she employed to take down the person who was running the Kessel Mines was just such a cool and super obscure throwaway reference that I couldn't believe they included in the movie.
It goes a layer deeper, too, in all of the Legends content, featuring Darth Maul. He's a practitioner of Terrascasi. So when you trace the lineage of where she would have learned it from, and she says Dryden taught her, and where would Dryden learn it? And his fighting style is two double-bladed, like, brass knuckles with serrated edges, and he fights in that sort of same florid style that Maul does, that they traced those links all the way back to Maul 2, which is another one of those random clues that you have to be looking for deeply to understand why that might be an indication that Maul is the only person that could have shown up in that hologram.
Was there any other references or Easter eggs that either of you really... Actually, one I want to point out is Anthony Daniels, who plays C-3PO, is in the movie in the part where Chewbacca is saving the other Wookiees. Originally, it was reported that he was playing one of the other Wookiees, but he's actually, if you watch it, you can actually see him. He's a human that is kind of assisting them in a way to escape.
He actually has lines, too. He's got speaking lines.
You hear him. In repeated viewings, I have definitely heard the lines.
Yeah. So that was nice that he gets speaking. He's had speaking lines in every Star Wars film, and that streak hasn't been broken, which is nice. My other favorites were the references Lando made to all of his books.
The Lando Chronicles?
Yeah, the Lando Chronicles, but he mentions, so there's three of them, the Flame Wind of Ocean, the Mind Harp of Sharu, and the Star Cave of Thon Boca, and he mentions the stories of all three of those books over the course of the movie. And that made me really happy because this movie felt very much like those early Brian Daley, L. Neil Smith, Han and Lando adventures that we got before we had really even any other movies. Or at least certainly not anything beyond Return of the Jedi.
It's interesting that they made all this, extended universe not canon. They made it Legends, and slowly but surely they're kind of incorporating whatever bits they want or need, or just for fun into the canon by referencing.
Yeah, well, and they've changed things about it too, right? So this movie recasts L3 as the droid Lando had on those adventures, rather than Wuffy Ra, the really weird alien disguised as a robot that he was carrying in those books.
Yeah,
stuff like that, where they're bringing in what they need to and leaving the rest behind.
one last thing, we had a story on the site from HT detailing some deleted scenes that were not included in this film. Brad, can you tell us about them?
Yeah, so as with any movie, there are scenes that don't end up making the cut, and
especially a movie that you reshoot 70% of the film.
Right, exactly. There's bound to be some stuff that ends up on the cutting room floor, if you will. So one of the more interesting ones, we talked a bit about how it would have been interesting to see more time that Han spent working for the Imperial Army and whatnot. Is apparently there's a scene involving Han Solo where we actually get to see him where he was going through aerial training because he wanted to be a pilot at the Imperial Academy. But as he mentions in the movie, he ended up getting kicked out for having a mind of his own. And so this scene actually would have shown him doing the aerial training and then getting kicked out, being relegated to becoming one of the infantry who is just, troops on the ground. Apparently... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say that there was a cameo for an Easter egg that got cut from those scenes as well.
Yeah, the two characters, Tag and Bink.
Yeah.
Like this dim-witted duo, and like they happen to appear in the background of several famous Star Wars scenes just by happenstance. And that would have actually allowed the Kazdans to be appearing in the movie themselves. And they actually intended... They made sure that was their cameo because they assumed that scene wouldn't get cut, and of course it ended up getting cut anyway.
That is funny.
And then there's also apparently a completely different introduction to Chewbacca where Han would have met Chewbacca in an entirely different way. So there we see in the movie, they get met up because Han gets thrown into this kind of prison after Beckett makes it seem like he is a deserter. And Chewbacca is this, seems like he's this monster chained up in there.
Which, by the way, isn't it weird that Chewbacca, I guess 8 people before Han got thrown in there? No?
I mean, you got to do what you got to do.
Yeah, you got to survive when you're chained up on a mud planet. So apparently, originally, Han had did become a pilot, and he ran away from the Empire, and he ended up crashing a ship into a hangar, and he was brought before a tribunal that would sentence him to Mimban, however you pronounce it, the mud planet, and that's where he would meet Chewie. And I guess they would be partnered together, and they would go up against Imperial mech walkers, and apparently Chewie was originally supposed to rescue Han, and Han would have kind of been the one who was more in debt to Chewie than Chewie being, in debt to Han Solo for, saving him.
It's funny, Mimban there is a huge deep cut reference too. That's where the first EU novel, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, was set. And it's interesting that it was set on this planet that was supposed to be this fog-shrouded mud planet because Alan Dean Foster was told to write the book as though it could be the sequel to Star Wars if Star Wars bombed and George Lucas wanted to make another one, which is why it doesn't have a space battle, and it's all set in this thing where on a planet where you could shoot on a soundstage and just fog it up and make it seem as though it goes on forever. And it was really interesting to see that Bradford Young photographed the planet in exactly that way.
That does it for today's extended edition of Slash Film Daily. Bryan, where can people find more of your work online?
If they want to, they can follow me on Twitter at Swankmatron, and I can direct them to wherever else. But you can read about my Star Wars writings with you on Slash Film at StarWars.com, at Sci-Fi, occasionally HowStuffWorks.com, and if they ask, I will direct them to anything, just on Twitter. So, like I said, at SwankMotron.
Well, it's great having you here to, give us your knowledge on a galaxy far, far away.
As a huge Star Wars fan, I am in awe of how encyclopedic your knowledge is of the Star Wars universe. Like, there's stuff that that I've never even heard of.
It's a curse too sometimes.
Brad, where can people find more of your work?
I'm always writing on slashfilm.com. You can also check me out on Twitter at Ethan_Anderton, and I've got my own podcast called Go Flix Yourself on iTunes and other podcasting platforms.
And please go take a look at the show notes. We have links to all the coverage on Solo: A Star Wars Story, including Brian's, mine, Brad's, everybody. Like everything we talked about today, there's a bit more that you can learn and dive into on slashfilm.com. This podcast, Slash Film Daily, is published every weekday on iTunes, Google Play, Overcast, Spotify, all the popular podcast apps. If you have a question, comment, concern, send it to peter@slashfilm.com. And please go rate and review this podcast on iTunes. Tell your friends, spread the word. We'll see you tomorrow.